Hey everyone, welcome to this special session where we are trying to make sense of what's happening on the Ukraine's border with Russia. While you'll hear, a lot of expert talk over the next half an hour or so, remind me and bring me up to speed. To get you the answers to the most basic questions in the simplest terms possible. Um, the idea is for everyone, not just the big investors, but also for the small investors, who are worried about their, life savings being stuck in the market, and as well as for those of us who care about, the world being a better place than what it is, and are we entering a war? No matter what your motivation might be, I think there are some 3 or 4 basic questions that everyone is sort of looking for answers. One is it going to be an outright war if there isn't one already? We will try to find that out from both Mr. Chalani and Mr. Baga. We will also try to find out what is the motive for such a war, because that will then tell us how far each side might be willing to go with this entire flexing of muscles, and that has implications for markets too. And what is India's stance and what should it be? I think these are some of the fundamental questions that are bothering people at this moment. Um, and of course, each one of these will lead us to more questions. And so, if you have any, please do tag BI India, Business Insider India @BI India is the handle, or Stock Tweets, and send in your questions on Twitter, which we'll be more than happy to post to our experts, because that's what we are, messengers at the end of the day, and get you the answers that you need. Yash, I hope are we ready?
Yeah, so I've sent the invites to both Ajay sir and Brahma sir. Can you guys please just accept it? And thank you so much, Sriram, for giving us that very quick intro. And while they both get on as speakers, again, I'll just take the opportunity to introduce StockTwits to all the listeners. So basically, StockTwits is the OG platform for investors and traders. Our mission is to empower retail investors to become sharper and become the platform that hosts global conversations across asset classes, be it stocks, cryptos, NFTs, different investing styles and experience levels. We recently raised $30 million in a Series B funding from FTX, which is one of the largest crypto exchanges in the world, and TimesBridge, which is the VC arm of Times Group, with whom we have a strategic partnership to help us in our mission for the Indian markets. Um, as you guys already know, I am joined by Sriram. He's the editor in chief at Business Insider. Ajay Baga, who's a well known market expert, and Professor Brahma Chalani, who is a strategic affairs expert. Um, all right, I think Brahma sir, you are in as a speaker, so I'll just start with my first question, and something that is really very pressing, and something that everyone wants to know the answer to. That is it going to be an outright war? If not, that we are in one already.
I think the current crisis has the makings of a drawn out, and it will be an extended and dangerous confrontation between Russia and the US. And Ukraine is serving as a pawn for both sides. The issue is not about Ukraine, actually. The issue is about NATO's eastward expansion. The United States has a Monroe Doctrine in place. That doctrine was formulated nearly 200 years ago. Under the doctrine, the US doesn't allow any unfriendly state to emerge in its backyard. So the entire hemisphere, North America, Central America, and South America, the US ensures that there's no unfriendly state, that no state ties up with a hostile power. But the US has expanded NATO to Russia's borders. And Russia is feeling increasingly embittered. The fact that now NATO forces are deployed in the Baltic states, where the old Soviet Union had its largest military bases. So there is now a sort of a backlash that is happening in Russia against this NATO expansionism. And what Putin is doing is seeking to utilize the nationalistic fervor in Russia to assert Russia's interests In a way, there are three big winners in this present crisis. One is the American President Joe Biden. His approval ratings are at a new low, and this crisis has managed to divert attention from Biden's domestic problems. The second winner is clearly, or the biggest winner is President Putin of Russia, because this crisis fortifies his standing at home. It also makes Russia richer. This crisis has raised oil and gas prices very sharply. Oil is at a 7-year high. Gas prices have jumped significantly. So Russia is reaping a major profits windfall. So this is great crisis as far as Russian finances are concerned. And the third winner from this crisis is the Chinese President Xi Jinping, because the American fixation on Russia that Joe Biden personifies is a gift that keeps on giving. For China, this opens more space for expansionism, and the next possible target of Xi Jinping is likely to be Taiwan. And the losers, I would say, the one main loser is Ukraine for sure, because it's a pawn in the US-Russia confrontation. And the rest of the world is also a loser. If you look at India's energy import bill, it has soared at a time when it's facing Chinese aggression. India is paying now billions of dollars extra every week to import oil and LNG. So this is a significant impact on India's finances. So this confrontation is certainly bad news for India. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Jilani, for an exhaustive sort of introductory, laying out the land for us. For what I wonder is how do even these countries, including US or Russia, how are they able to afford this war? Even they are coming out of a pandemic with record debt levels, economies in not the best shape. I mean, maybe US is recovering and sort of on a growth path, but inflation is a concern for them as well. And that sort of also, so I think there are two parts to this question. One is how are they affording this? Number two is who are the friends of Russia here? There is a Saudi Arabia which also benefits from high oil prices. So are you all from a strategic response point of view from different parts of the world? Are you seeing some of these things play out, and could you elaborate that for us a little bit?
Well, to be frank, the military-industrial complex in the US as well as in Russia is very strong. The US prospers in war. The US, thanks to the Trump 4-year presidency, has not waged a new war. And the military-industrial complex in the US clearly is itching for some war, not with Russia though, because a US-Russia war is going to be disastrous. It's going to even escalate to very dangerous levels and potentially even make a nuclear weapons use scenario possible. But both Russia and the US would like to have a war, but not between themselves, but a war elsewhere. Ukraine is certainly the flashpoint, and there could be a war in Ukraine. And the US, as you know, has very clearly ruled out coming to Ukraine's direct defense. Biden has made that statement publicly, not once, but repeatedly, that the US will not come to NATO, not come to Ukraine's direct defense. But both for the US and Russia, the Ukraine is a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. And as I said, this crisis is good both for Biden and for Putin. The issue really is whether an actual shooting war might begin. Right now, the Western media is talking about a Russian invasion, an invasion that has already begun. Now, that's an exaggeration because nothing has changed fundamentally. The status quo has not been disturbed so far. What is happening is that Russia has recognized the secession, the independence of two breakaway small enclaves of Ukraine. Those enclaves were already independent. And according to allegations by Washington, that Russian special forces had been operating in those enclaves for the last 7 years or more. Now that, according to the Americans, Russian regular forces are entering those two enclaves, doesn't change the reality. It doesn't change the status quo. Those enclaves were already under Russia's control or sway. So despite the exaggerated media reporting as to what is happening at the moment, one has to be careful and not reach the conclusion that an invasion has already happened. No, the Russians are far from initiating an invasion. They have massed forces along Ukraine's borders from three sides. According to US estimates, there are between 100 to 150,000 Russian troops massed along Ukraine's borders. But since we're discussing Ukraine, let us not forget something closer home. The number of troops that China has deployed against India is larger than the total number of Russian forces against Ukraine. There are about 200,000, 2 lakh Chinese troops currently deployed against India. And that is the largest military buildup by one country against the other. So while we discuss this Ukraine crisis, let's not forget the China crisis that India faces.
All right. Let me get an Ajay sir as well. So you heard Mr. Chelani speak. Do you think is this, all these factors that he mentioned, are they already in sync with what the market is pricing in, or do you see any additional risks for the market?
Yeah, Yash, overall, if you see, the market is finding it difficult to price in this ambiguity because it is strategic ambiguity that is being practiced at a national scale and an international scale. So, if the Russians don't know what Putin will do next, except for his coterie of ex-KGB operators. Even probably his foreign minister is not aware of Putin's next step. They're all being strung along. Definitely, Western intelligence is not able to penetrate this coterie of 5 to 6 very close ex-KGB personnel who are really controlling Russia now and who are conflating the national interest of Russia with their own personal interests. So it's very difficult for the markets. Markets were already facing a very difficult year in terms of enhanced volatility with inflation, high commodity prices, supply chain bottlenecks, all the post pandemic fallouts on economies, slowing down economies, and the worst of all, a certain withdrawal of liquidity from the markets by central banks and a reduction in the fiscal stimulus by most governments around the world. And what we started off in the discussion, I would like to point out the failure of the sanctions since 2014. Today, Russia has a very low debt to GDP. The corporate sector in Russia has paid down most of its external debt. The debt to GDP for Russia is 30%, as against 250 to 300% in most of the West and in Japan. So they have done a very good job in de risking over the last 8 years. You look at the foreign reserves of 640 billion. You look at the gold reserves for a number of years after 2015 Minsk Accord. Russia was buying about 300 tons of gold a year, and that was a big contributor into the golden phase of gold after a number of years when we saw gold prices going up. They have a $250 billion national fund. And as Mr. Chelani mentioned, every time the oil price goes up, the Russian economy benefits. We have an estimate at $95 per barrel of Russia earning $65 billion extra in this calendar year. So I would say, yes, economically they have suffered, the people have suffered, minor irritation, but where the West has failed is really calling out Putin. They had, right from the 90s, they had the uh, data on Putin's personal wealth, on Putin and the oligarchs' misdeeds. They chose to engage with Putin, thinking that they can engage with a dictator like this. What happened in what happened in Europe in the 1930s? The big decision, I think, in front of markets was 2008 Georgia, 1938 Munich, and taking over parts of Czechoslovakia. Was 2014 Czechoslovakia, or is 2022 Czechoslovakia? That's the big question. That has it already happened? When Russia calls it peacekeeping, when Biden calls it an invasion, and when Ukraine says this is formalization of an informal de facto line of control which came in 2014 itself, and which the Minsk Accord of 2015 was trying to resolve. If there is such a wide disparity in perceptions, what can the poor market think of? We have to go back to simple fundamentals in such a scenario. The volatility is huge because every market ending, you don't know what you will open with on the next day. Will there be a summit, or will there be some further escalation? That's the big risk. Putin has all the levers. In game theory, we call it escalation dominance, where you dominate the escalation. So the West has put itself into a corner that we will react to Putin. Nobody is saying. The Ukrainian president went live 3 days back and he pleaded, what are you waiting for? Announce your sanctions. So the West, the sanctions that were announced, Japan said we will not give visas to these breakaway enclaves citizens. So the sanctions have come with a thud, not a roar. And today the markets heaved a sigh of relief. If this is the best Putin could do, and if this is the worst the West could do, we are okay. We will get a chance to move ahead. Corporate earnings will not be impacted. The bigger second order effect you have to look at is 22 years after ruling, Putin is looking at legacy. Is it a game changer? Is he going to upend the international rule of law by bringing in a 19th century? Angela Merkel, first time in 2014, called Putin a 19th century personality in a 21st century world. And that's playing out. He is ready to go to war for Mother Russia, for the unification of the Russian people. And it's not new. The Western intelligence is aware. In 1999, the 300 people that died in blocks of apartments being blown up, there is still a finger pointing at just a few months later. They were, citizens were patrolling their apartment blocks to avoid such a situation. They found somebody putting sacks of white powder with some detonators and running away. That car was caught. The car was from the Secret Service, FSB. But before that news came out, when the police came in, they said, oh, our counters, our analyzers are saying, yes, this was a similar attack to what was done in Moscow earlier, and 300 people died. this is what Chechenian rebels are doing to you. Later on, it came out, they said, oh, it was sugar. It was just a trial run and it was done by the FSB, but it was covered by a pliant media. The West should have taken on right then that you are doing false flag operations against your own people. You've blown up 300 people to take on Chechnya and finish off the Chechenian rebels. Nothing happened. Putin was fated. And just one more thing I would like to add before I hand it back to you. 2012, in the presidential debates, Mitt Romney brought up Russia. He says Russia under Putin is emerging as a threat. Obama made a joke of him. That was the historic mistake of the US after 2001, getting embroiled in the Middle East, sinking itself into Afghanistan. Maybe that was needed, and taking the eye off Putin totally. Today, they don't have the wherewithal except for the nuclear deterrent. The isolationism that Trump has brought in has not left much of appetite. You look at Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, each of them has about 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers in their army. How can any of them stand up to the Russian bear? Of course, the NATO treaties are there, but will the German soldier or the French soldier go to die when this treaty is actually tested? Even though it was framed in 1949, it has been tested only in Kosovo, that also under the UN sanctions, not on the NATO banner. They have gone and died in Afghanistan, yes, but that was on a voluntary basis, not as a full-fledged NATO expeditionary force. So, in all this, it's a morass, difficult to understand. It will hurt globalization, it will hurt internationalism, it leads to isolationism, and it hurts the markets definitely if there is an economic impact of a larger scale. What we are hoping that just like 2014, it's a very small impact. It's a sharp correction followed by a sharp recovery, and the world moves on. De facto, these enclaves have been Russian controlled. So no major change has happened except for what is being spun in the media by all these states with their own national interests. Over to you, Yash.
Thank you, Ajay, for a very exhaustive. I think I didn't know you had so much. I've always known you as a market guru, but you've laid down the sequence of events, and I'm sure there was a lot to unpack there. And for those of you who have joined us just now, I just want to quickly sort of line up the takeaways so far from both Brahma Chelani and Ajay Bagga. Mr. Chelani says that both US and Russia seem to want a war, but not in their own countries because the makers of those weapons and arms in those countries would want some business. It's been some time since they have sold any. Russia wants this tension also because it allows the country's oil makers to charge more for their commodity, makes it richer, as he says. Ajay pointed out that Putin has had the upper hand in this negotiation because he is setting the terms of engagement by being one step ahead. He says something, he does something, and the West is forced to react. And in global strategic affairs, this always has implication because it kind of sort of it allows one person to have an upper hand over the other. Or rather one side to have an upper hand over the other. I wonder if Brahma Chelani agrees or disagrees with some of the strategic observations from Ajay. But I also have a couple of other questions from your last answer, Mr. Chelani. You pointed out that Russia and US want a war, but not in their own countries. Is Ukraine too close to Russia for it to have allow this tension to simmer longer or escalate for that matter?
Ukraine is special for Russia because that's where the Russian civilization was born. Ukraine is very much integral, or at least seen from the Russian perspective, seen as central to the Russian culture. When President Putin made his speech yesterday, he was addressing not just Russians at home, he said very clearly that I'm also addressing my Ukrainian brothers and sisters. So Ukraine is, of course, too close to Russia. The issue is about NATO and the potential deployment of Western weapons on Ukrainian soil against Russia. To put it in historical terms, just the way the US created Pakistan from the 1950s as a frontline foe against India by arming it and making it a member of US-led military alliances like SEATO and CENTO. Similarly, Russia fears that Ukraine could become a Pakistan on its southwestern borders. And President Putin has made it very clear that he will not tolerate a quote-unquote Pakistan on its southwestern borders. So this crisis is about that, about preventing Ukraine from becoming a frontline militarized foe of Russia. How Putin is going to accomplish his objectives is something difficult to comprehend. What we know is that he's pursuing an incremental approach that's keeping the US on tenterhooks. The US is unable to read his next move. It's getting repeatedly surprised because look at this paradox. On one hand, we had President Biden publicly and repeatedly saying for days on end that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent. In fact, he even set a date for the Russian invasion, February 16. That date came and went without a Russian invasion. After that, he said, "Oh, it's coming in the coming days." But what we have seen so far is Russia only recognizing those two autonomous enclaves of Ukraine as independent republics. Nothing more has happened. And the military situation hasn't changed in a fundamental sense. And nobody can actually guess what Putin's next move could be. He may decide not to escalate matters because he has already driven home the point that Russia will not accept a Ukraine that is militarized and a cat's paw for NATO. That point has been driven home. He might stop there and keep the crisis simmering so that the West, especially the NATO alliance, is completely at a loss, not knowing as to how he would make his next move. So he could either stop there or he could spring another surprise. And I know one cannot rule that out, but I think one has to keep in mind one important thing, if I could make that point, because it's often missed out in the discussion over the present confrontation between the US and Russia, which is that whenever the Americans slap sanctions on any country, I'm not talking about Russia only, any country, whether it's Iran, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's Sudan, name any country, the main beneficiary of American sanctions since the end of the Cold War has been just one country, China. American sanctions from Latin America and Africa to Asia have advanced China's strategic and commercial interests. If you look at Iran, the Americans imposed sanctions on Iran, and then they escalated those sanctions. In effect, they imposed an embargo on the world that you cannot import Iranian oil. So India complied with that embargo. even though it was not a UN embargo, it had no international sanction to it. Yet India complied like other American friends and allies, leaving China to buy Iranian oil at a huge discount and to become Iran's top investor and military partner. Similarly, India's next door neighbor, Myanmar, with which India shares a long border. The American sanctions against Myanmar since last year have pushed Myanmar into China's arms. So, American sanctions, especially against neighboring countries of India, whether it's Iran or Myanmar, actually undercut Indian interests and promote Chinese interests. Now, these sanctions that Biden has imposed on Russia yesterday, this is the third round of sanctions against Russia that Biden has imposed since taking office just 13 months ago. And these sanctions are welcome news for China. Now, the financial sanctions against Russia and the additional harsh financial sanctions that Biden threatened to impose if Russia invades the Ukrainian heartland, those sanctions will turn China into Russia's banker. And will also allow China to tap additional supplies of Russian oil and gas, which is what China needs to build a safety net in case the West imposes an energy embargo on China in the event that China invades Taiwan. So China is seeking to build a robust safety net that can withstand a Western energy embargo. So the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project being put on hold under US pressure by Germany is wonderful news for China, because it allows China then to sign additional contracts to buy Russian gas. So one has to keep in mind that this particular crisis has important implications for India, and those implications are all very adverse. I mentioned about the fact that India's energy import bill, both for oil and for LNG, has really shot up. India is also the world's largest importer of gold, and the gold price has risen sharply too. So in a way, India is paying billions of dollars every week, additional expenditure of billions of dollars every week to import the same quantities of oil, LNG, and gold. And this is just in terms of the finances, but geopolitically, this crisis and the American reliance on just one weapon, sanctions, will further impinge on Indian interests. If the Americans impose their very harsh sanctions, financial sanctions on Russia, including cutting Russian banks off from the international SWIFT system, how will India pay for its weapon purchases from Russia? How will India invest in the Russian Far East, in the hydrocarbon sector there? So there's going to be many complications for India if the Americans continue to ramp up their sanctions policy against Russia.
Okay.
Ajay sir, that would be-
Yes, once again, I want to sort of unpack this a little bit. I'm sorry to step in like that. But again, so much, in that one answer, Mr. Chilani, I want to sort of start from the beginning where you said, Ukraine is important to Russia. Right? And I think that sort of is in sync with Putin's message last week about in sort of trying to. So for those of you, again, let me simplify this further. What Mr. Chilani said is that Ukraine is important to Russia. That's the birth of the Russian civilization, so to speak. And then he also said that allowing Ukraine to join the NATO will make it like a Pakistan for Russia, where the so-called enemy forces will be always parked, funded, and be the nuisance, in the same way as Pakistan is on the Indian borders. Uh, and in that sense, I think, Mr. Rani, it makes sense. The Putin's speech now makes sense for us because he tried to delegitimize Ukraine's existence by saying that it was Lenin's mistake that gave birth to that country. Correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm reading it, in a wrong way. And the second thing that you said is that, sanctions hurt everyone else except more than it does Russia. I also read your piece on how US is focusing on the wrong enemy. It should focus on China and not on Russia. I think you have summarized all of that in my research into your last two answers. So what I would like to ask then is, um, what are the options, right? Here, so let's unpack this into what does Putin want, assuming Putin is in a position to demand at this stage, and how it stands in front of us is, he wants the NATO to pull back from the frontline countries like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and other former members of the defunct Warsaw Pact. Is this something that US or NATO will agree to? If yes, under what circumstances? If not, then does Putin has the space and the resources to escalate this even further? I think let's take it one at a time. I have 5 pointers here. So, do you think US will agree to it? Is that what you would like US to see? To see US doing?
A compromise is possible, and I hope that the US reaches some understanding with Russia so that the US can focus on its main challenger, which is China. China is seeking to supplant the US as the global hegemon. Russia has no such ambitions because it has no capacity to be in America's shoes. Russia's ambitions are regional. They are focused on its security concerns in its immediate neighborhood. So the US, if it can reach some compromise with Moscow, will free up space to deal with its big challenger, China. So it's in American long-term interest not to get overstretched by taking on both China and Russia. If it can actually have better relations with Russia, it manages to free up space to deal with the real challenge. But it's important to answer your question by taking one step back and look at how this crisis arose. The US wanted NATO to continue after the Cold War because NATO enabled the US to dominate European security. But NATO's existence and eastward expansion slowly began rallying Moscow. Long before Putin even entered politics, President Yeltsin, who was regarded in the US as an American-friendly Russian president, said publicly in 1994 that this NATO expansionism is going to split Europe again, and he didn't say those words, but he implied that this would be the beginning of a new Cold War. So what Putin is saying is nothing new. This has been the feeling in Russia for a long time. When the Cold War ended and Russia emerged triumphant from that Cold War, the US had the option of seeking to co-opt Russia and bring Russia into the Western fold, just the way the US brought Germany and Japan into the Western fold after World War II. But the US instead took a long, extended victory lap, a victory lap that lasted for years, and that victory lap embittered relations with Russia and contributed eventually to Russia's remilitarization and resurgence. So that's how the present crisis arose. In fact, last autumn, last autumn, just a few months ago, the US and NATO held military exercises near Russia's coast in the Black Sea. And as the New York Times reported, that really enraged Moscow. So those military exercises foreshadowed the present crisis. Now, coming to what the compromise can look like. The US has already expanded NATO to the back door or the front door of Russia. It's there in the Baltic states. And the NATO forces are stationed in the Baltic states. They will remain there. So the compromise is about more limited aspects, which is that the Americans will not deploy any offensive weapons on Ukraine soil or any missiles that can be reachable, that could be Russia reachable. And more importantly, that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. In fact, nobody in NATO wants Ukraine to be a member of NATO because Ukraine is a very troubled, internally fractured, and highly corrupt state, and no NATO member state wants Ukraine to become a member of NATO. In fact, to be a member of NATO, every existing member state has to ratify the addition of a new member state. So there is absolutely no chance whatsoever of Ukraine becoming a NATO member. So making that concession in private negotiations will be accepting the reality on the ground that Ukraine doesn't qualify to be a NATO member. But the real thing that Russia wants are security guarantees that the soil of Ukraine or the soil of Georgia, which is another potential NATO member, will not become a staging ground for deploying weapons against Russia. If you recall what happened in 1962, when the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, deployed or was deploying missiles in Cuba, which is quite close to the United States. And the US triggered a crisis which became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. And that crisis forced the Soviet Union to pull back missiles from Cuba. But that missile crisis provided China a cover to invade India in 1962. So that crisis has a better ring to it for India. But what Putin is now doing is Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. He is now trying to force America not to even think of deploying missiles on Ukrainian soil against Russia.
Ajay sir, my next question is to you now. I mean, it's pretty clear that the conflict is has many dimensions to it, and it's not as straightforward, and it will be a bit of a long drawn thing. So, assuming in that case, like you said, Russia benefits from these oil prices and commodity prices being higher. In that case, what would be the investment strategy going forward? Because a lot of our young viewers are interested in knowing that how do you navigate the markets in these situations, and which are the sectors or the pockets where you would deploy your money in right now.
So one is get your asset allocation correct. That is very critical in any juncture, but more in a very highly volatile scenario, where markets go up 500, 600 points on a usual day. That kind of volatility is very bad for your mental health. So very critical. Look at your asset allocation. Second, it's not a buy on dips market anymore. Don't try to play that game that on every dip I'll come in and it's going only one way. We have seen that. The market has gone down substantially from its all-time highs, and the and it's true for global markets. Third, what is the biggest certainty in this markets? 2 points: volatility, which you can't do much about, that you just benefit from it by staying invested in a diverse portfolio of quality companies for long periods of time. Second, this will be a stock pickers market. It's not going to be the index investing, the passive investing. Third, should you stop your index passive investing? No. Continue that for your longer term asset allocation for meeting your financial goals. But who will deliver better returns? It will be the active fund managers this year, not the passive funds. That is very clear. The stock pickers will rule the roost. Fourth, what is the fourth certainty in these markets is inflation is going to be there at least for a year more. Even if this crisis is resolved, the commodity complex is in a super cycle. There is a demand supply mismatch. There is, right from 2008 onwards, substantial underinvestment in commodity exploration and bringing them to markets. It's not going to go away in 2-3 years at least. So inflation is going to be there. Given all that, and knowing that the central banks don't have appetite to bring in more liquidity, there is no space for rate cuts. Given that the governments, being so indebted, are looking at fiscal rectitude rather than fiscal stimulus, what do? You invest for the inflation and you invest for lesser abundant liquidity. It will be there, it won't be so abundant. What does better? What research shows us? Financials tend to outperform. Energy does very well. Energy was the top performing last year. Again, they're doing well. Look at $38 billion is what the oil majors are doing in terms of share buybacks. They've not done it for a long period of time. Huge amounts of money. A lot of nations are getting a huge amount of money and a lot of companies. So energy, materials tend to do very well. Capital goods suppliers, industrials tend to do well in this kind of an inflationary environment. Real estate, people go back to real assets. Gold used to do well. Gold is now impacted by a lot of things, including the liquidity which has gone into cryptocurrencies. So gold has got a more measured advance, but even then, as Mr. Chelani mentioned, it crossed $1,900. But the traditional factor of gold being an inflation hedge has been seriously impeded. So I'm not suggesting that. Stocks are a good place to be in, so long as it's as per your asset allocation. You're sticking to quality companies with cash flows, good management, so will manage through a tough year. And the last part is look at REITs. REITs and InvITs tend to outperform again in inflationary times because rentals go up. They are able to give you better dividends. So look at REITs and then special situations. So as companies go down in such scenarios, suppose a company gets a lot of its business out of Russia. You know, we used to have a customer and he was importing stuff. And then all of a sudden, I was working in a foreign bank. We had done an LC, and his goods were seized at one of the ports. Why? Because the Shipping Corporation of India ship which was bringing his goods had been designated as a special designated national by the US government. And so a neutral port seized the ship. His goods were lying there. We were pushing him that repay your loan taken from us, and he couldn't fulfill it. So you don't know where these sanctions come and bite us. For us in India, also an additional issue is look at the beggar nation Pakistan, which can't pay its loans. And Imran Khan has gone running up to Putin as he went running up to Xi Jinping. Mr. Chelani has written about that earlier. But for us, Russia is a tried and tested friend. What does this Russian Chinese closeness mean? Ultimately, Putin knows that just like China lays claim to large tracts of northeastern, northwestern India. Same way, it lays claim to a lot of Far East Russia, right up to Vladivostok on the coast. So it's not that Xi Jinping will stop with minor countries. It has the eastern part of Russia also in its, and that was one of the reasons for the Stalin Mao fallout ultimately. So it's not that simple. India has done well. We have to practice real politics. Moral clarity is good in our personal lives. For countries, I believe it's real politics. You have to have national interests which are supreme, and at times the moral clarity has to be clouded for that. And this is a tested friend who stood by us in 1971, earlier than that, after that. And India is, that's why I abstained from most of the votes and said, please go and talk and find a solution. So, not much of an impact on the markets as things stand today, not much of a impact of sanctions. Look at what's coming out of Europe. Mario Draghi, the ex central bank head for Europe, now the Italian premier, he's saying keep energy out of sanctions on Russia. What does Russia have? What is its biggest export? It's energy, metals, and wheat and other food grains. If you're keeping energy out of sanctions, so the Italian view is very clear. Macron is coming up for elections. He might be there, might not be there post April. The German chancellor is new to the job, still finding. I mean, Angela Merkel could have talked down Putin. Uh, Olaf is not able to. And Putin has won the war of perception with the French head of state, the German head of state going, and Russia able to say no to a summit with the most powerful man supposedly in the world. And but he went and attended February 4th Beijing Olympics opening ceremony with his newfound friend. That's a friendship based on real politics. That's what will happen. So even managing your portfolio, look at it uh, with the sieve of real politics, stick to quality, no panic selling, it's not going to end. If the markets go down very sharply, there is abundant liquidity on the sidelines. There is not abundant new liquidity being created. Keep that difference. And inflation, what works? As I said, financial, energy, materials, capital good related, real estate, REITs, InvITs, these are the sectors that will benefit.
Awesome. The conversation got a bit too serious, and obviously because that is the nature of the topic. But just to make it slightly lighter, what's common between Allu Arjun from Pushpa and Putin is that dono jhukega nahi. So that is kind of the situation that we are faced with right now. But let's
Yash,
open the
you
forum,
burst
Sriram, to
Putin's bubble and how? He was going for global domination. You turned him into Pushpa.
Pushpa be danger, sir. So, anyway, just a joke. We'll open the forum to all the listeners. If you guys have any questions, if you guys have any thoughts that you want to share on the topic, please send us the request, and we'll be more than happy to make you guys the speakers as well.
Yes, that will be important. I think we're all trying to make sense of what's happening, and we're asking experts what is likely to happen. And on that note, I'm sure more the people, the more questions. And if we have missed on any important bit, we would request our listeners to chip in and let us know what's bothering them more than what we have already asked. I think Bharat Vaklu has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. I just had a question related to, first of all, I'd like to thank the Brahma and Ajay for a very insightful set of observations. My one question really pertains to the fact that what is really driving uh, global aggression? I noticed that even China is, it's kind of flexing its muscles. America, despite being out of Afghanistan, is talking about giving arms to the Europeans, and there seems to be some kind of a series of factors which seem to be pushing nations towards the brink, so to say. So, what do you think is behind all this? Is it merely the sales of arms? Is that something that's at play? Is it the fact that energy is now a thing which nations are looking at very closely? Because if Germany and Russia come together through the Nord Stream 2, it might change the geopolitical equation. So what really is driving all this? I'd like our experts to try and put a finger on that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Mr. Chelani answered that. I think, Bharat, you sort of summarized that in your question itself. Yes, there are some people who want, a market to sell weapons. There are, Russia being a commodity producer wants a bigger, better price for oil, and of course, and I think there are strategic interests as well in terms of, like Brahma Chelani explained, that US and the NATO was coming too close to its borders when it comes to Ukraine, and that's not something. I mean, Russia may not have the might for world domination at this point of time, but it definitely has the might to protect its borders, or it sees it as a threat. And I'm not sort of passing a verdict here on the validity of that fear, but it is something that Putin faces, and Putin has sort of in the past we've known Putin to sort of be very vocal and very expressive about his sort of nostalgic view of the Soviet Union, and how he always felt like that it shouldn't have happened. The Soviet Union shouldn't have collapsed, and which is why, and he sort of not just looking for a little more money. He's also looking for some of the lost glory, I suppose. There was lost Russian glory. So I think it's a mix of all of this that's playing out on the Russia-Ukraine border. But otherwise, I think it's also most countries, including China, are viewing US as a weaker force right now, which is partly a fact. And it is not the unipolar world like Mr. Chelani has described it in many of his articles over the last couple of decades. And the decline of the US will lead to more forces sort of raising their heads and saying that we would like a little bit of that respect, that fear, for our own so countries like Russia and China would want people to be able to negotiate with them as equals, and not as any inferior a country than the US. I think it's a mix of all of this playing out. Over to you, Ajay, if you have anything to add to this.
No, you summarized it very well. I'll just add a market's perspective added to that. That how ruthless can some of these regimes get to be? Look at China. Uh, at the base of all of this is also pandering to a domestic xenophobic population and pointing all their ills at an amorphous outsider. So look at China with that common prosperity theme of Xi Jinping. He has blown away $1.5 trillion out of the Chinese internet companies. Just last week, when they spoke about their food delivery major, and $26 billion of market cap went away when they put caps on what they can charge to restaurants as discounts. So look at what these countries are ready to do to their capital. Putin did the same when he came to power after Yeltsin. He destroyed the oligarchs who had flourished post Gorbachev, and he brought in his own set of oligarchs. Ukraine, as Professor Chelani already mentioned, is very high on the corruption index. If Transparency International ranks Russia at 136, Ukraine is at 122. Does anyone know they shut down 5 channels which were against the government last year? Under this present dispensation, so called more moderate dispensation. So it's global. There is a scarcity. There are lesser resources, more aspirations. There is not enough for everybody. And it's back to probably the time of the rise of fascism That kind of a scenario where you have these demagogues who are coming in, and markets also suffer. So if you were an investor in Alibaba, you never uh, put in, pun intended, for Yash, you never put in a scenario that their own country would incarcerate the chairman, force all of them to start donating to social causes and go and work in villages and start breaking up these companies, all for common prosperity and to stay in power. So they've ridden that horse. Now that horse has been flogged. They have the confidence, and it's totally against Deng's doctrine of keeping a very low profile. Xi Jinping is in your face. He's taking bases all over the country. I would totally agree with Professor Chelani. Russia with 140 million people, declining population, is not your enemy for next 20 years. It has the nuclear arsenal that you have to manage, but more than that, nothing. China is the big enemy, and even for India, unfortunately, with our huge border and with Pakistan and China sitting, just last week, China sold 25 of its fourth generation jets to Pakistan. Still, we allow, I mean, you try to buy a laptop in India, you can't get a non made in China. And we are allowing all Chinese goods. They are building 8 fast submarines, super silent submarines for the Pakistanis. They are giving 4 frigates. India is going to build 4 frigates in the next 10 years. Chinese are giving them 4 frigates in the next 3 years. So somebody who's so openly aligned with your uh, most bitter enemy, you're allowing them a free pass into your economy thanks to WTO. So that was the biggest mistake the West made of allowing China into WTO. We are all paying for that. We'll pay more for that. But keeping the jingoism aside, we need that nationalism also to come in and to understand, where the national interest is getting hurt, and that's clearly China as far as India goes.
Aditi, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello, Ajay sir. So I have one question over here. So I was like going through article or watching some videos. So उसमें I read like there was one person who's sharing a opinion that कि अगर पूरी world का attention Russia Ukraine पे जा सकता है, and then the probably chance that China can also in a side look into maybe Taiwan, or then it can also come to like India ka part, and there's Arunachal Pradesh, like they can also increase their presence. So what do you think? Do you think that China can actually do like जब पूरे world का attention उस side है, then China can also come over here and increase its military presence and all?
Yeah,
Well,
that
I think that's the answer that Mr. Chelani gave earlier, with that it is happening simultaneously, while the point is that I think it's the answer is there in what Ajay also said earlier in the last answer. It is a multipolar world, and this is not something that we are used to, or rather, not something that the Americans are used to for many decades now. They not sort of trained to think like that, right? They were the only room mein ek hi gunda hai types, right? So and that was America. So they are not comfortable with the other sort of powers coming to the table with the same kind of might that they have enjoyed. But having said that, yes, so it is happening reportedly, and and that is the concern that India has. And like Mr. Jalani explained, that even when you try to punish Russia by putting economic sanctions, it just drives a lot of that business away towards China. It allows China to sort of break deals. For example, he gave us the example of the Iranian sanctions. So everyone, including India, stopped buying oil from Iran. So Iran's had to drop its price to a record low, and guess who bought that oil? China bought it, and it stocked it up. So tomorrow, if US decides, US ने अगर कह दिया कि we will not allow China anyone to sell oil to China, it has already built up a substantial amount of reserves that will allow it to go on for a little while without having to buy oil from the other parts of the world. So it is a different world that we are less familiar with. And to add to Ajay's point, Ajay, on the point that you made about the mistakes of the past. I mean, what's happening today is also something that George W. Bush, the junior one, sort of opened us up for. I mean, he was the first one to say that Ukraine should be allowed into the NATO and sort of should be invited. And the reason, Aditi, and to sort of answer your question with that reference, the reason why I bring it up is because this happened in late 2000, 2008, 9 sometime, which is before Obama administration came in. That's when I think Bush made that statement. There, nobody protested in. There was no such escalation of this sort at that time. But it is happening now because the rest of the world sees America as a weaker power. It's something usko hul de ke nikal sakte hain abhi, right? And I think that is partly what is at play. I hope that answers your question, Aditi.
Sriram, I just want to come in and just ask one thing to Ajay sir. So, you mentioned about how Ukraine itself has been facing a lot of corruption. They closed 5 news channels and, free presses like a dream over there. So, while a lot of this conversation is around, trying to suggest that this is just uncalled for US aggression of trying to get near Russia's borders by enrolling Ukraine into the NATO. Is it the other way around that NATO wants to free itself from Russia's clutches and wants to join the NATO and try to reduce Russia's influence? Kind of in a similar way like how Hong Kong wants to get rid of China and get their own freedom and get away from the mainland. Is that kind of the thing that is going on here?
Yeah, very, very interesting question, and it will take many hours to answer it fully, right from Gorbachev's time. And you must remember, Brezhnev was a Ukrainian, Khrushchev was a Ukrainian, Gorbachev's mother was a Ukrainian. So it's a joint country. It's like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh was a one country. And even now, they have relatives across the borders. So it was a very free society. And they are the RUS, they are the Rus, combined Rus. Real politics terms, Belarus today is a colony of Russia. 30,000 soldiers went for an exercise and they have stayed back. They won't come back. So Belarus has already been occupied. The West is not talking about it at all. And their opposition has been very brutally suppressed. So the point comes back that do people have a right to their own self-determination within sovereign states? India's view is that don't break up states, but overall there should be democracy. What is Russia and China worldview? It is that autocracy. All these liberal values have weakened society. The West and the American are hollowed out societies, and this traditional values that we bring in, the strength, might is right, the Bismarck kind of a view is what it's a 19th century view. So that is true. The Bush senior was a very close friend of Gorbachev. And what has come out of all this, Yash, if you look at it, if you had a nuclear arsenal, never get rid of it. If Iran didn't have
Ajay sir, you're on mute.
all this time I spoke on mute. Unbelievable.
No. Just at that point, if you have a nuclear arsenal, don't give it up.
If you have a nuclear arsenal, don't give it up. Think of what happened to Gaddafi. Saddam Hussein was near a bomb. The Israelis bombed him. Indira Gandhi's time, Israelis said, give us overflight rights, so give us refueling, and we will bomb Kahota for you and keep Pakistan away from a bomb. We didn't agree. Iran kept its bomb. North Korea, despite all the sanctions, by having the bomb, is not touched. No one dares to go near them. So the autocrats and the despots of the world have learned. And there is a talk in Ukraine. You know, Ukraine was the, when Russia broke up in 91, Ukraine had the third biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world because it was a part of the Soviet Empire, and Chernobyl happened in Ukraine. They, in 94, there was the Minsk Accord 1, under which UK, US, and Russia assured protection to Ukraine for Ukraine returning all its nuclear weapons into the safekeeping of the Russians. They gave up the nukes, see what has happened to them. Neither UK nor US nor the Russians protected them. The Russians actually have invaded them. Crimea is more confusing because Crimea was a part of, it was an independent nation taken over by the Russian Tsarist Empire, gifted by Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, to his homeland as a part of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic within the USSR. So the Russians always thought they are taking back what was falsely given by Khrushchev. There was no issue on that. So very interesting, Yash. It is a confused, it is a complex history, but the risk is what we have not had a major war in since 45 in the European mainland. If you take away the breakup of the Yugoslav Republic, that was the biggest massacre Europeans have seen in a long time. This kind of massing of armies can lead to miscalculations. And you know, in this modern day and age, nuclear missiles being put in Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia next to Russia, it is meaningless. You know, China with this hypersonic test, what it did in last June, and they probably improved on that. They were sending the missile over the South Pole because on the North Pole, US is able to intercept missiles. The missile went from China to South Pole and then turned into American heartland. So the missiles are able to travel much longer, refuel on the way, and they have something like at times multiple warheads. So even if you destroy one missile, one out of the five will go through. So it is meaningless for anyone to say, don't have nuclear weapons next to me because the range has increased manyfold. And India with 150 nuclear weapons is as good as China with 350, going to 3,000, or Russia with 7,400. We can hold our own. At least we can assure destruction. So that's a big thing. We have said no first use, which is good, but we need to keep that deterrent.
Rafia, you can go ahead with your question.
Thank you so much. I've been listening to the discussion with interest, and I've learned a lot from Professor Chalani. My question is that, I mean, regionally speaking, Pakistan is flexing its position, right? Because they're allied, they've already given Russia permission to use Gwadar and in January, and now they're going up again with this pipeline thing. God, I'm not sure what all it involves. Um, I don't understand why India is not trying to flex its position with Russia more, and try to sort of get some kinds of assurances or accommodations for the fact that it's going to, I mean, I know that the sort of official line is that India is neutral, but the fact is India has been aligned with Russia for a very long time. So that's one part of the question. The other part is an observation which regarding the US and a unipolar versus multipolar world. Um, I mean, regardless of what the US says, the fact is that at the moment they are going to face the least costs of this conflict. First of all, they're off, they have oceans on either side. They have, they are the ones who have the richest consumers. So they have a domestic consumer market that they can continue to sort of generate. Generate revenue and income and money from, um, and all they've done is shuffle some existing troops around Europe where they already have bases, and they've said, oh, okay, if we'll put this financial sanction, that financial sanction on you. But countries like India face such a huge cost because they are in the market. They're in the so can someone mute their mic? um they're in the market for energy, and this is and this is directly impacting the amount of energy available for the world. So I would just like yeah, I just like to know from all the colleagues, and on this space, to what as to what they think about these two issues. Thank you so much for giving me the mic.
Um, your question was too long, Rafia, but just to go back and
First question is just why is
why
India
India?
not flexing? Yeah,
Yeah,
why aren't they flexing more? And the second is that what are they going to do about the fact that about the increased competition for energy?
I think probably for the first part of the question, I mean, the easy answer would be that obviously while we have close ties with Russia, we have in terms of trade and all, also US is a very important ally. So we don't want to boast that fact that uh, we're close with Russia. We need to keep Uncle Sam. We need to be in the good books of Uncle Sam as well. So probably that would just be a very simple answer to that. And for the second question, I think I'll ask Ajay sir to answer it.
No, energy definitely, and the sooner we move to renewables and get out of this energy dependence on certain countries, the better it is for the world when it's more distributed and this kind of power goes away. But, that's about at least 15 to 20 years away. Still, if you see on a global level, we are 85% dependent on fossil fuels, which are captured by a few countries because of geographical accidents of history. So that's not going away, and you're very right. There are ruling elites, there are cartels, there are a lot of manipulation that goes in to this energy market, and India, as a big importer, who's importing 84% of its oil, who has substantial coal deposits but has not been able to get out of importing coal, for example. Uh, we are doing the right thing by going after renewables and the clean energy initiative, but it's going to take a very long time. We are like 95% fossil fuels right now, but we have started. So very true. And big oil has a huge impact on the global relations. Biden, when he came to power, he says he will not take a call from MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Now the US diplomats are talking to Saudi that pump more oil so that the dependence on the Russians is lesser. They're trying to get more shale oil also running. So US is okay, 9.5 million barrels a day. They are meeting and they are exporting a bit. It's countries like India and Japan, which are totally dependent on exports, who get caught in the middle. 10% increase in oil prices, 0.5% increase in our consumer inflation, and it's a 1% increase in our wholesale inflation. So clearly, immediately, we get an impact. Over to you, Yash.
All right. I think Sriram has a question. We'll just wait for him to connect. There seems to be some issue with his connection, but all right. I think that's all the time that we have for today. Ajay sir, thank you so much for taking the time out and doing this. Professor Chalani had to drop off because he had an important call to answer, but really appreciate his comments and his thoughts on this entire topic. And obviously, this is something which is on the top of everyone's minds because of the way that we are seeing markets pan out. Nifty and Sensex falling for a 6th straight day, which is its longest losing streak in almost 13 months. So clearly tensions are there. The biggest takeaway obviously is the fact that this will be a bit of a long drawn out issue. We won't have a straightforward or an immediate resolution to this because of how multifaceted the issue or the conflict is, and with so many parties being involved. Ajay sir, once again, thank you so much for doing this, and really appreciate all your knowledge and wisdom that you have with respect to geopolitics and as well as markets. And thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. We've had consistently almost 1,000 plus listeners. So I hope everyone had some takeaway or had enjoyed this session, and would really love to do this again with you, Ajay sir, and on hopefully on a better topic, and things are much good looking than they are currently.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Thank you.